The barrier islands of Sanibel and Captiva are world-renowned for their natural beauty, ecological authenticity, and old Florida lifestyle. And right where the two islands meet is this extra special place where shelling, fishing, and just relaxing are the primary pastimes. This is Blind Pass, for nearly 1,000 years one of the most ever-changing waterways on Lee County's barrier islands. But during that same period, there has been one constant, a unique sense of place, a place of history that draws both locals and visitors. And at the heart of all that is enchanted about this locale is this man-made structure, the Blind Pass Bridge.
I think the most important part of Blind Pass is connecting Sanibel and Captiva. It's always been Sandcap Island, Sandcap Road. It's always been the isolation of both of the islands compared to the mainland, so they depended on each other, and this was the connecting thread.
In this video presentation, we will examine the history of the bridges that have occupied Blind Pass over the past century, talk about the constantly changing geology of the pass itself, and bring you several great fishing, shelling, and people stories generated from this exceptional setting. Our story begins in 1918, when the first bridge across Blind Pass was built. Let's set the scene for you. In January of that year, President Woodrow Wilson gave his famous 14-point speech that would outline peace terms for the end of World War I. That war would actually end in November of that same year, and the patriotic sentiment that year because of the war led to a new sporting tradition. The 1918 World Series marked the first time the Star-Spangled Banner was performed at a Major League game. And guess who the winner of that World Series was? Some of you guessed it, the Boston Red Sox. And we now know it was the last series they would win until 2004. Also that same year, a young man by the name of Charles Lindbergh graduated from high school in Minnesota and went on to become one of the world's most famous aviators and an occasional visitor to Captiva, along with his wife, author Anne Morrow Lindbergh. She was actually inspired by the shells she collected on Captiva to write her most famous work, Gift from the Sea, which is still popular today. Two of Lindbergh's famous friends, Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, were also said to visit Sanibel and Captiva during winter stays at their homes in Fort Myers. And here we have a very small but interesting link to the first Blind Pass Bridge. You see, the population of Captiva at the time was very small, but some of the residents and visitors were wealthy enough to own a Model T or some other newfangled automobile that was being popularized then by Henry Ford and others. They reportedly grew tired of taking the ferry service between Sanibel and Captiva that was offered by local farmer John Boring. They wanted a bridge. So they petitioned the Lee County Board of Commissioners and got them to build a wooden bridge that was 11 feet wide and 8 feet above high water. Because the U.S. War Department had jurisdiction over all U.S. waterways that might potentially affect shipping traffic or military logistics, the War Department had to put their stamp of approval on plans for that Blind Pass Bridge. Thomas Edison and cartoonist J.N. Ding Darling were said to have enjoyed rumbling over this new wooden structure to go fishing on Captiva. In fact, the rumbling was a major feature of the new bridge apparently, because some islanders said it sounded like a Gatling gun when you drove across it. Once the new bridge was built, one prominent local businessman named Clarence Rutland converted a Model T he owned into a taxi. He would pick up salesmen from Tampa at one of Sanibel's landings, transport them over the rugged dirt and sand and shell roads of Sanibel to the Blind Pass Bridge, rumble across that one-lane bridge, then they would sell their wares to residents and hotel visitors. These salesmen were called drummers, and they were often employed by large hardware stores from Tampa like Knight and Wall. They catered to the islanders' need for hardware, fishing tackle, household goods, and other items not easily obtainable on a remote barrier island. It's said that Rutland would charge $25 for a single day of transporting the out-of-town drummers across the two islands. And by the way, only one car at a time could get across this bridge, so the rule was whoever got to the bridge first had the right-of-way, and someone coming from the other island had to back up, even if they were already on the bridge, and give way. This reportedly led to many heated arguments over the years.
I also heard a story when I first moved here from Tom Holtz, who was the son of Marty Holtz, who was the fire commissioner when I was hired. And Tom told me that, and he had been here 14 years at that time, so that put him out here in the 50s. And he said the story was, and he said it's true, that there were two cars on the island. And the two cars managed to hit each other on that bridge, on the wood bridge. He said it was only one lane long and it was dark out. He said, I don't think there was a lot of damage or anybody was hurt, but it was the fact that there were basically two cars and they hit each other on the two islands.
The years immediately following construction of the first Blind Pass Bridge also happened to coincide with the Florida land boom of the 1920s. And while the east coast of Florida got most of the attention, Southwest Florida also got a lot of attention from newspapers in New York City and the Northeast and the Midwest. This picture in 1921 shows Grace Hall Hemingway painting on a beach near Blind Pass. Grace Hemingway was a noted artist in her own right, but she is perhaps better known as the mother of writer Ernest Hemingway. Grace's granddaughter Hillary of Cape Coral told us that her grandmother, grandfather, and other family members vacationed often on Sanibel for many years, but she didn't know if Ernest joined them because he was not always on good terms with his parents. Much of this new attention to Southwest Florida came from people interested in the fishing opportunities here. Just a year before the 1918 bridge was completed, President Theodore Roosevelt wrote an article for a national magazine outlining his experiences catching so-called devilfish, we know them as rays today, in the waters off Captiva. Captiva hotels capitalized on this newfound recognition among sportsmen by placing ads in local and out-of-town newspapers about the many varieties of fish that could be caught here. Tarpon was at the top of most lists, and indeed, many tarpon were caught on the Blind Pass Bridge, but sea bass, kingfish, sawfish, redfish, mackerel, sea trout, grouper, and snapper were also on the menu. Lifelong island residents Jim Pickens and Ralph Woodring told us snook were one of the main catches at the early Blind Pass bridges.
You could catch redfish, snook, almost anything that was in the water and that was in flowing water, I'll put it that way.
Blind Pass Bridge, from the time that I recall until I was out of high school, I guess, was one of the most renowned areas to catch snook anywhere around. And that being, as Jim said, when the tide was flowing in, you know, the snook would just lay under there like cordwood. The guys would use a cane pole and a wire line, because we didn't have the synthetic heavy-duty lines like we do nowadays, and a piece of a broomstick, usually 5-6 inches long, with a hook on the end of it, and they would what they call swish. They'd drop it down and do a figure 8 in the water, and the snook was so damn thick they would hit it, and it was unbelievable the amount of fish that they would catch. And I know this from an absolute positive fact that I was there a number of times. They would catch the fish and lay them in the middle of the bridge between the two ruts where the cars would go.
Snook back in those days were called soapfish. And they called them soapfish because if you didn't take the skin off, the outer skin off, they tasted like oxidol. And I don't know who finally discovered that after you fillet him, you flip him over and you cut the skin off, and it's a really good sweet meat. So they would, even to the point where there were those who would, out in the Pine Island Sound, San Carlos Bay and so forth, fishermen that when their gill nets were getting old and they were going to get rid of them anyhow would net snook and sell them for fertilizer. Yeah, that's part of what happened to snook too.
There were two significant developments in the life of the first Blind Pass Bridge in 1926. In January of that year, another member of one of America's most famous families would visit this area and take this picture of the original wooden bridge. The photographer, Cornelius Vanderbilt IV, direct descendant and namesake of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built a modest ferry service in the 1800s into one of America's greatest family fortunes. But our Blind Pass Vanderbilt photographer, Neil as he was known, was something of an outcast to his family. The reason? He wanted to work for a living as a journalist, a profession detested by many other family members. It's not known exactly why he took this picture of the Blind Pass Bridge in 1926, along with the Captiva Hotel and other pictures of the area, but we can guess it had something to do with a string of newspapers he owned at the time, including one in Miami called the Illustrated Daily Tab. These newspapers had a penchant for high-end photography and travel-related articles, and it's possible that Vanderbilt was going to publish the pictures he took on Captiva for a travel feature. But because of an ongoing financial dispute with his family, his newspaper empire actually folded soon after he took this picture. The second significant Blind Pass development of 1926 involved the Great Miami Hurricane. That storm would also hit southwest Florida and cause enough damage to the 1918 bridge that it had to be rebuilt. The reconstructed wooden bridge would last until the early 1950s, when it was replaced with the first of two concrete bridges. Here you see the actual construction of the 1954 bridge as documented by Sanibel filmmaker Hadwin Starbuck and provided to us by Sanibel library historian Betty Anholt.
There is footage of the building of the bridge, and evidently Mr. Starbuck was standing on the old bridge, on the wooden bridge, and was filming the mixing and pouring of concrete for the bed of the bridge. It gives a lot of insight into how manually important the building of a bridge was at that point in time compared to now with concrete slabs pre-stressed and brought in. It was poured and smoothed right there on the bed.
You may notice in this bridge construction video that the pass doesn't look quite like it does today. As we said earlier, Blind Pass is in a constant state of change which continues even to this day. Take a look at this 1950 aerial view and we'll show you what we mean. Now here's the 1926 wooden bridge that we just showed you in the video. Here's Captiva, here's Sanibel. You'll notice that Captiva's beach extended well past the Blind Pass Bridge all the way to what is Bowman's Beach on Sanibel today. That may account for why the Blind Pass condominiums are on Bowman's Beach Road. These 1950s home movies from the late fishing and shelling guide Bob Sabatino show you what the channel looked like. Here's one of Bob's children standing directly behind the Castaways restaurant, which is today the Mad Hatter. He's looking west toward the Gulf of Mexico, but you'll notice the view of the Gulf is blocked by trees and sand. Here's that same view today. The trees and sand are gone, and the back of the Mad Hatter, as you know, bumps right up to the Gulf of Mexico. Back in the 50s, Bob worked for Dean Mitchell, who owned the Castaways cottages, marina, and a home built by his father Mitch, an early settler in the Blind Pass Santiva area. In an interview for the Captiva Island Historical Society some years ago, Bob explained what the pass was like back in the 50s and 60s.
Now, if you can picture this, the bridge was over here, leading to Captiva. The Castaways was here. There was a waterway that went under the bridge, and there was land on this side with high Australian pines where you had to look in between the pine trees to see the Gulf, right? And that Blind Pass meandered all the way down to what is now Bowman's Beach. That's where it led out into the Gulf. Now, I used to take people all the way down to the tip of that peninsula for shelling, and it was the most fantastic shelling you could imagine back then, right? I mean, you would find alphabet cone, you would find, you name it, you would find it down there. checkerboard clams, sunrays. I mean, it was just great. And then before you got down there, when you went to Silver Key, if you went on to the mud flats on the left side, you'd get angel wings, horse conchs, and I mean, it was just fantastic shelling. You know, I mean, I used to have pictures of buckets of horse conchs and, you know, just laid out, stuff like that. In fact, they did an article at the news press. A woman came out interviewing me, and she took these fantastic pictures of me digging an angel wing. Remember now, this is when you get live shells. You know, this is before all the fuddy-duddy, you know, you can't give any live shells and stuff like that. And, I mean, it showed the horse conchs when I was picking them up. I mean, it was just incredible.
By the way, that long Captiva beach tail started washing away in the 60s, and by 1974, the pass was open again in a manner very similar to the way it exists today. But storms have opened and closed the pass a few times over the past 30 years, and islanders debate whether to spend money to keep it open permanently.
Well, Blind Pass geologically is about 800 years old, and that pass has changed shape constantly through the centuries and can be open, can be closed, can be a mile further down, can be further up. It just changes all the time. It's really dynamic. There's a lot of reasons it's called Blind Pass. When the Spaniards would pass by here, they wouldn't see that there was a passage between the Gulf and the bay. They would actually have to explore that by longboat, rowing, or small sailing vessels. And so it became the hidden mouth. Boca Ciega means hidden mouth. In the 1880s, the Army Corps of Engineers charted it. It would almost look like it does today. So it changes all the time. The shifting sands have to do with the currents that are coming out and an intersection with currents that are coming from the north to the south. And so you can get it speeding up because it'll be like a funnel. And during times when it's kind of narrow and there's extreme high tides out back, you'll get treacherous currents carrying people even out to sea.
It was a struggle for us to swim them back. You know, we had to go sideways to the current, obviously.
Fishing guide Ron Rossi was witness to one of Blind Pass's tragedies when he was young and growing up on Captiva. He and a surfing buddy helped rescue two swimmers who got caught up in the swift-flowing current.
We paddled out to them, put them on our surfboards, and proceeded to swim them back to shore. We didn't know at the time there was a third man, their friend, and they were trying to save him because he was the first one to get swept out in the current. And we never saw him, and sadly they found him the next morning washed up on the beach down by Tweenwater's Inn.
You can expect the Blind Pass will continue to change, that sand won't hold still. And it'll depend on storms, it'll depend on currents. That sand is always on the move.
Like the pass itself, the surrounding community known as Santiva has experienced a lot of change as well. Here's another view looking south from Captiva in the 1950s, where Captiva's shoreline extended all the way to Bowman's Beach. Here's the Mitchell family's Castaways resort property, and here is the Del Sega community. The marina no longer exists, but the motel and cottages are still here and operated by Rochester Resorts, owners of Tweenwater's Inn. The original home of Dean Mitchell that we showed you earlier is also still around. And as we mentioned earlier, the Mad Hatter restaurant is in the location of the former Castaways restaurant. Another Santiva landmark known as Betty's Hawaiian Village, operated by Betty Clements in the 1960s, is also still in existence and now part of the existing Castaways collection. But despite all the changes, there's nearly universal agreement that Blind Pass and Santiva hold a special place in the hearts and minds of the people whose families have lived, worked, and played here.
And we used to rent a house down on Captiva, right beside the library and the graveyard, literally one door over from that. And I say that was about 76, and that was when I think we met your family, the Jensens. My dad was very fond of Red Jensen, the boy's father. So we'd go over and hang out with him and listen to wild fishing tales about the tarpon that he caught on just about a bamboo cane by the telling with, you know, spider web for a line. It was a fantastic fish, and there it was on the wall.
My family moved down here in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was, my dad was a fishing guide and owned a gas station up in Martha's Vineyard. And he met a friend up there named Jack Thomas, was telling him he needed to come down here and go fishing for a week with him. And so he came down here for the week to just do some fishing, and at the end of the week, by the end of the week he sold his gas station, sold everything, and started the fishing guide program out of South Seas, which were at the end of the island. The fishing was, he said, it was out of control. It was just incredible. So he came down here and saw this phenomenal snook fishing, and actually this is one of the first spots he fished was Blind Pass, and him and Jack came out here at nighttime on a full moon, and he said it was just incredible. I mean, this is some of the best fishing, some of the best fishing in Florida is right in this one area.
Well, my connection with Blind Pass came very quickly after we moved here, because we lived on Sanibel for 1 year and then moved to Captiva. And while working on Sanibel, I was working for the Sanibel Fire Department, and I was working for the Baileys at the Bailey General Store. I moved to Captiva, and they had an opening for a manager of the Santiva Mini Mart, is what it was called at the time. It's now the Santiva General Store. We sold a lot of single beers. We sold groceries to people who had come all the way up here and either didn't have any or they just needed something. We had a little bit of produce, a small amount of meat. And when I took the store over, the bulk of the front of the store was all fishing equipment. Fishing rods, reels, bait. Because Blind Pass was just a great place to fish off the bridge and on both shorelines there. But unfortunately, the pass closed. I think just about when I took over, 77 and 78, it started to close, and then it closed off, so there was really no fishing. There was an old-timer that worked at the store for me. His name was Dave. His last name escapes me, and he was a man of very few words. And I remember I was trying to get as much information from him as I could because he'd lived in the area a long time. And I said, well, the Blind Pass is closed. When will it open again? And he said, it was open for 11 years, then it was closed for 11 years, then it was open for 7. I'm guessing it'll be closed for 7, he said. And we went with that, and he was about right.
I guess I could say that my history here started back in 1950 because I grew up for quite a while in Englewood, just up the coast. My dad and my uncle owned a ranch back in behind Placida. And we used to come down here to Sanibel and in our little boat and stuff. But really we started living here. Annie and I bought our property in 2002. And it's just a little old 50s bungalow. We were looking for a place that was as close to the Florida I knew as a kid as we could find. And it's just a little old bungalow on a shell road at the west end of Captiva, and it's about 2 feet above the normal high tide, so we're a little nervous in hurricane season, but otherwise it's been a great 15 years.
Probably my greatest connection with Blind Pass is my grandfather, on my dad's side. They were retired, but they owned a farm up there, and they had a bunch of plants, and they sell flowers, and they would save all their money, and they would come down here in the wintertime and rented a house like 4 docks up. And so since I was a little kid, my grandfather, we would go on the beach side and sip the sand for sand fleas and go fish for fish for sheep's head off the dock. I mean, I have pictures of me where I was 3 years old with a life jacket on catching sheep's head with my grandfather. So I've always had a really good connection with Blind Pass.
We were starting the whole Blind Pass thing, and the water was just going up and down. You know, we were talking to our neighbors, and some of them had been there for 15, 20 years before we had, so since the 80s. And they were saying, yeah, you know, it used to be so great in here. We could go out on our dock in June at night and put a lantern down off the edge of our dock, and these shrimp would come floating by, coming in from the Gulf, and we could just sit there and dip fresh shrimp off our dock, you know. And I said, wow, that's great, you know. And I actually remember doing that off that old plank and pole bridge that goes to Manasota Key up in Englewood. And so it was like it brought back this great memory for me.
So actually it looks the same, but the building over here was the Buttonwood Barbecue, and in the day it had delicious barbecue, but it was one of those places where the people who couldn't make it to Timmy's Nook to drink in its secret bar, came to the Buttonwood Barbecue, and there was a small bar. And if you needed to secure, or if you had magic beans and imagined how great it would be that a dock or a boathouse appeared on your property overnight, this was the place to recruit the gentlemen who would be prepared to do that. Now, receipts were not something they were interested in providing or had heard of, and any sort of credit arrangement would be frowned upon in the extreme. But if you wanted a dock to appear on this island, this is where, if you were looking for mercenaries in the dock building world, they could be found at the bar there.
So Kurt was a clockmaker from Germany and ended up here in the Blind Pass area and started his business. Ran his business in this building and had the one gas pump right out here.
He was a character because when I first met him, he would come to the store usually late in the afternoon, and usually in swimming shorts and a long terry cloth robe, sometimes armed with a handgun. Yes, it was just his way. I never ever saw him draw the gun, but you could see the gun
was always packing.
there. He was usually packing a gun.
Yeah, so Kurt would package these clocks, and I came up with an idea of getting sand dollars off the beach, and I got these frames, glued sand dollars on there, and used Kurt's parts and made clocks, and sold them on Sanibel and Captiva. And I know the Tuttle's Seahorse Shop on Sanibel took in a few of them.
At this end of the road, there's Tommy Burns, said, who was adopted by the Burns family, who are possibly the kindest people you ever run into your life, and that carries for the entire family. They're just as good as all get out. He used to sell coconuts on the side of the road, and there was all these other sort of little cottage industries where people said and they would do it in their driveway. There's a chap down here who this is Seagull House, it's called, a very small little house. And the chap there would make crab cages, just individual ones for people. And he would stack them outside, and it was one of those honor systems where, if it was $5 for a crab cage, it was a box. You put the money in, and then you took your crab cage and caught them in the bayous or whatever, which was a lovely thing.
Well, it was one of the earliest areas settled on the island, actually. The south end of the colony was settled down there by the lighthouse, and then actually it was up on Wolford, which is where the sanctuary is now. But our Santiva area was settled a little bit after that, and those canals were dug in the 50s and stuff like that. And Blind Pass has been opened and closed of its own accord, off and on over the millennia. But I think Blind Pass provides the quality of life that everybody who lives in that area really came for. And there are a lot of people who love living at this end of the island because it's not busy, it's not crazy, it's not like the other end of the island. And I think Blind Pass is the thing that provides that quality of life, and that the fishery, the wildlife, all the birds, and generally speaking, just the water flow and the way the water moves throughout all our neighborhoods it's important to all of us. And I hope that people can go away understanding that even though that's what's important to us, what's really important here is the ecology of the whole ecozone, all the way down to the other end of Clam Bayou and out into Wolford Flats and up Roosevelt Channel. That is, as I said, it's the second biggest bayou system on the island, and it's really important environmentally.
The current Blind Pass Bridge was opened in 1990 with a better load-bearing capacity, improved resistance to hurricanes, and engineering designed to last for the next half-century. We don't know exactly how Blind Pass will shift and change over the next 100 years, but in the minds of those lucky enough to live, visit, or play here, one thing will always remain the same.
It's a paradise. I mean, it really is. The water's right there, the birds, the fish, all that stuff hasn't changed very much. And of course, there's Blind Pass, which is pretty amazing.